Okay, you have, I think, and if you haven't yet, you will have very shortly, a full slide pack, and you also have a full commentary paper accompanying it. So that enables me, in fact, to speed up the fast lane, as Anna Marie has said, and to rattle through it fairly rapidly. Anything that's not covered in this presentation or that isn't clear can be read up more fully in the handout materials, or alternatively raised in the question and answer session, which I think Anna Marie has in mind for later on. So the first few slides are really just to give you some background. Most of it's been covered, so I'm going to gallop along past it already. The genesis of the proposals, the main features of the proposals, the timing and the implementation, which are now likely to be there initially end of December 2012, mid-2013. It'll probably run into September for the technical matters, but all going well, the basic political accord should be towards just before the summer, and then still looking at implementation shortly thereafter, depending on the precise transposition times allowed. Now, the main objectives of the proposals are summarised on that slide for you. And it's a key part of the 2020 programme to make Europe competitive, and either make it competitive or keep it competitive, depending on your point of view. And you'll see there on the lower half of that slide a number of the key features which really affect this from a practitioner perspective. And by practitioner, I'm including all of us participants in these processes. The efficiency of public expenditure. There's a fascinating paper on the Commission's website of the costs of procurement, the proportions of the different procedures that are used, which percentages are opted for, what is the percentage cost of procurement relative to the percentage relative to the actual cost of the purchase itself. In other words, how much is expended on the procurement formalities. It's in 2011 generated by PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ecolis. It's on the Commission website. It's a fascinating read. Now, on the actual precise objectives on the lower half of that slide also, there is clarification, which really means codification of a number of the case law provisions or the case law jurisprudence which has been handed down to us, both primarily by the Court of Justice of the European Union, but also some fascinating decisions of the national courts. The objective of that is a little bit different, I would emphasise, in my own opinion. It's a little bit different from what would typically be the objective of legislation post-case law in the UK and Ireland. Typically, where you've had the South Sea bubble or you've had various adventures and somebody sits down to write a Companies Act, it isn't just to codify what has happened, but there'll be a democratic or a parliamentary input and which will try to effect desired changes. Most of what is present in the proposals are in fact simply putting down in a single document what the cases are saying. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's important to understand that in most of those instances, it's not a radical reform. Rather, it's an attempt to elicit and divine what are the principles that now have to be obeyed and how they can be set out simply. So on matters such as, for example, change, on matters of the use of experience and so forth, Janneka's case that has tortured people, it tends to be of that nature. Now, you have therefore thereafter a number of the measures dealing with efficiency and how the greater use, for instance, of a negotiated procedure is now permitted. You have there a reminder of the 4 exceptional circumstances where there's permitted recourse to the negotiated procedure at present following prior publication of a contract notice. It's important to recognise those limitations at the moment, and it's against those backgrounds that the greater use of the negotiated procedure is being canvassed. The precise details of it are set out more fully in those slides, including something on the first blob there akin to the use of a PIN, but in actually initiating a procurement as well over the coming year. And you notice also the second blob there on that slide, where the negotiations are needed to establish the legal or financial makeup of the project. It's drawing a little bit both from experience and from the features of the competitive dialogue, what are complex contracts and which it's proposed will be brought in. You'll notice on the third blob on that slide, but there will still not be a general carte blanche or freedom for public bodies to use the negotiated procedure. And we have there the salutary lesson of the Law Society case in England and Wales in the Court of Appeal just a few years ago in 2008, where there was a variation clause built into the contracts offered by the Legal Services Commission to solicitors firms or law firms in England and Wales to provide legally aided services. And it more or less said the Commission may make such changes as it sees fit. And the argument before the Court of Appeal in England was, well, if public general law applies, if public procurement law, EU procurement law as transposed at national level imposes limitations, then you must surely imply the limitations. But no, the Court of Appeal said must not do that. You cannot have this culture of bid low, very high, use variation clauses with a view to achieving radical change and a radically different remuneration basis. You'll also see that in some of the major cases in Northern Ireland and in particular the Henry Brothers decision. It's a frameworks case, but where it wasn't possible to have such a wide variation either, and the clause mustn't breach the rules on material change. You'll see there also that the requirement that before negotiations are concluded, everybody has to be given a final possibility of submitting a final tender. That's a little bit reflected in the current practice in England and Wales and in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic, of having something akin to a best and final offer, a BAFO, and that's effectively being built upon and fed into the proposals. You have better SME access in the proposals. Again, what will be the practical implications of that? You'll have seen this morning that effectively, just by reference to that last blob on that slide down there, the passport proposal as such, it hasn't really got the legs and it may not make its way through negotiations. But there will be probably the better use of access to databases. You have there, nevertheless, the good old principle of proportionality, and it's being reduced into writing in the proposals. For example, the second blob there explains that the yearly turnover requirement, minimum turnover requirement, that is to be 3 times the estimated contract value. That's a practical illustration of the principle of proportionality. You could say the same thing, for example, in relation to the level of insurance to be required. Don't overdo it, as it were. I'm just watching the clock, Anna Marie. Have I still a few minutes? Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Anna Marie. Similar to the encouragement of contracting authorities to split procurements into lots, there must be an explanation from the contracting authority if that's not being done. Again, that will have quite a significant impact on what will be the future practice in these matters. Subcontractors have had a very painful experience in the recession. There's legislation in the United Kingdom, in England and Wales in particular, since back about 1996 to protect subcontractors and effectively giving them or imposing the equivalent of direct contract obligations and recourse against for them directly to an awarding authority in certain circumstances. There is draft legislation to that effect in Ireland at the moment, moved by an independent senator and with government support. There will likely be fuller provision on that in the proposals as they take final shape, and that also will have a practical implication. So just summarising some of those likely implications, and it's just taking a basket of them. It's a helicopter view, as it were. But first of all, postponing the requirement of document submission is generally welcome, but there have been problematic experiences where it has been required already in certain member states, including Ireland, at administrative level. So it isn't a simple, gosh, motherhood and apple pie, good idea, implement it straight away. How it's implemented is not always the simplest. I believe that there's also a risk of dependence on third parties, that if bidders commit to producing verifying documentation and filing verifying documentation at the appropriate time as it gets close to contract award, and they can't do it, then they'll run the risk of exclusion. Now, that has other implications. First of all, they'll be aggrieved themselves. Secondly, they'll be putting pressure on third parties to produce documentation. For example, some of the public bodies for tax clearance certificates or licensing regime. One of the litigation in Northern Ireland involved parties not holding a particular security license. Well, if that's only applied for too late in the day, it may impose an unfair pressure on the relevant public authorities. Similarly, for example, auditors and others who are asked to produce, oh well, we need the next set of management accounts and certified by the auditors or whatever it happens to be, or updating financial statements. If they're not requested in time or for other good reason, they may not be readily available. That's a problem to be dealt with. I think also there's still the ongoing problem that a tenderer will assert and certify and declare that its financial statements are within relevant criteria. But there is still the problem, especially in the current recession, of bidders suffering material adverse change between the date of the declaration and the date when the documentation must be produced. And therefore, there may just be merit, for example, in the current economic times of bringing forward perhaps more than one bidder to that stage. So just in the same way that, for example, in PPPs in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland and the Republic, it's not unusual to have more than one preferred bidder or to have a reserve bidder brought forward. That may be necessary so as to prevent significant rewinds, if not collapses, of procurements and therefore cost and delay to all. The importance of providing for subcontractors we've already dealt with. On the efficiency, there are some shortening of the deadlines again, and it's recognising also the electronic element, and of course mandatory e-procurement has been mentioned. The financial thresholds are being maintained substantially, subject to whatever may yet emerge in terms of the compromises on Part A and Part B. And Claudia Romanini has already mentioned the importance of the WTO element, and indeed there was a new agreement on the government purchasing agreement within the WTO only last year. The passport is probably dead. On the social regime, again, that's likely to be further changed again, but still the current proposals are for a higher threshold, and up to now it's been Part B. That is quite a radical change. Similarly on social services, and it includes provision that the member states may, at their option, prohibit price only as the sole award criterion. That is a problem at the moment across a range of procurements, because if it's price only, it tends to be the lowest bidder only, and there's a little bit of some of the alleged low-cost airline treatment on some of these, and it's harder to reflect quality. It's a debate, and it's wider than the legal dimension. There's also likely to be a development of something along the lines of community criteria. Innovation partnerships are a completely new animal. And just as a practitioner on that, one question that troubles me just a little bit is, how does one know if it is truly innovating? That ought to be develop innovative products. I'm sorry for the typo. How does one know if there is already a comparable product on the market? And how does one search for that? And therefore, how does one avail of that exemption? It seems to me that may throw up some challenges. I've mentioned these legislative codifications. They're effectively codifications. So, for example, that on material change effectively codifies press-a-text. It doesn't, for instance, and understandably, it's not meant as a criticism, but it's just so that we all understand it, it doesn't purport to deal with change that happens in the course of the procurement. It's effectively post-contract change. But the same broad principles of press-a-text, I believe, still apply, and the absence of those written down in the revised directive doesn't mean that we have carte blanche to effect changes willy-nilly and go back to that Law Society case in England and Wales again, by way of an example. The third blob there, the degree of change, well, first of all, the second blob, really important because people lose sight of that. There's a lot of material out there saying that there's only a very small change, percentage change permissible. Not necessarily so. If there are objective variations, provisions which are objectively justifiable, then that's a really important provision. And I believe that it needs careful drafting and thinking at the very beginning of procurement processes, as Anna Marie has said on many occasions as well. Try and plan these things rather than just do them on the hoof, as it were. So if there are careful justificatory provisions for a wider scale of change, such as, for example, the remuneration of investment over a long period of time, or the sort of changes that were visible in the London Underground case, a 30-year programme, radical new tunnelling flooring to be built, radical new vehicles to be acquired, radical new safety regime, and so forth. That's objectively permissible. The euro conversion factors, for instance, that were evident in the Precitex case itself. Leanicus is, I think, again, I hope, put to bed, and in essence, I think that the better view of the Leanicus judgment, which some thought outlawed having regard to experience at all at the award stage, is now reflected, and you see it summarised there on the second blob, but where the organisation, qualification and experience of effectively the bid team are necessary to, are appropriate to measure and evaluate against an award criterion, that's fine. But you're not evaluating the tenderer or the bidding entity at that stage. That is for qualification stage, and that's what's reflected in the codification. Social and third pillar environmental are very important. Claudia Romanini has already spoken about life cycle cost. I believe it'll be a bigger factor. We have also the effects of the very important Dutch coffee case last year, and which will be reflected in the likely implications, taking my topic here, of what is going to be the effect on practices going forward. And I think that you'll have a careful elaboration of objective social, labour, environmental and third pillar factors, and which will need to be built into the tender documentation. You have obviously the acceptance in principle, provided it's done properly, of fair trade and eco-label criteria as per Dutch coffee. And then, as Claudia Romanini has already pointed out, the development of what exactly is permissible localism is, to my mind, still a little bit uncertain, and what elements of it are permissible and what are not. You have, for instance, cases like Nord Pas de Calais some years ago, and yet there could readily be abuses as well. On the social dimension, one of the features of the new directives are the breaches of social, environmental or labour laws, and you'll see that there is a discretion to exclude candidates at shortlisting stage where a contracting authority or an awarding authority may become aware of some of those breaches. I think it's very important to differentiate that from the provision for them as they stand at present, as I understand it, subject to any late changes. The provision for those factors which are in the provisions dealing with abnormally low tenders. Where they are featured in abnormally low tenders, then there's a right to eliminate, a duty to eliminate rather, on those grounds. So here it's discretionary, but in the case of abnormally low tenders, it's mandatory. That's an important dimension as well. There are some very complicated provisions on conflicts of interest. They haven't been mentioned an awful lot in the public domain. I hope they get simplified before the legislative process is over. Nobody is in favour of conflicts of interest, but just how they might complicate things, how they might lead to legislation, or beg your pardon, to litigation, are to be avoided. And then you have also the national monitoring body. I think I had put down there rather cautiously, it's not necessarily clear that this will see the light of day, given the level of resistance, significant resistance by member states. I know the Commission can't say it in so many words, but I believe it's actually dead as well. So that's a whistle-stop tour, with your permission, Anna Marie. And if there are any questions, they'll come later on. Thank you very much indeed. Deeply appreciated.